So Dr. Erickson, she investigates the experience and management of emotion within occupational and family contexts. In general, her work examines how emotional experiences vary across social status positions and how such differences affect the mental and physical health of individuals along with their interpersonal relationships. Dr. Erickson's research has primarily focused on the experience of registered nurses and how the demands of nursing profession impacts nurses' health. Really excited to hear about all of the research that you've done. You're doing great work. Welcome to the podium, Dr. Erickson. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And I also want to just extend a thank you to Aaron Macarius and Bob Chess, who've been kind to invite me here, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with all of you. I was struck actually by President Niemer's reflections, and hopefully with my co-speaker, focus on the issue of self-compassion might actually be the hardest piece, the notion of forgiving oneself. And I also like the themes of the notion of change. And also, I'll just sort of give a shout out to Megan and the starfish story to recognize that all of us are just one starfish, but we're all worth saving, we're all worth forgiving, and also we're also connected to a broader system and live in that culture of the ocean that is surrounding us and we're so ensconced in it, we oftentimes don't even see that it's there. So I'm going to use that as sort of just inviting you to think a little bit and maybe rethink a few things related to compassion, and particularly what I and some other scholars refer to as compassion capability or compassion capacity, which is just asking you to think about compassion not as an individual behavior solely, but also as an element of our organizational systems, and want to talk a little bit about the basis for cultivating that within your own organizations, even amidst the change and uncertainty and complexity that organizations have today. So I'd like to start a little bit with sort of what we know, and I'd like to ask you, I think in your programs there's a piece of paper and there's some pens. If you could just grab that out, I'd really like to start with what we know, but more specifically with what you know, and kind of build from there. So if you can grab that piece of paper, I'd like to just have you take a moment to think about the last time you felt cared for at work. The last time you felt cared for at work. What was the situation? Who was involved besides you? Who helped make you feel cared for? And what did they say or what did they do? If you could just take a few moments to jot that down, that last time, and what comes to mind, and who comes to mind. And as you're reflecting on that time, if you could just note a couple other things. How long did that interaction take to make you feel what maybe you're evoking right now? How long was that interaction? And also, how long ago did this last experience occur? It is hard to see up here, and there's a lot of people here, but I'd just like to take a little bit of a read. When you think about this last experience that you had feeling cared for, first I'll just note that is an experience of you being a recipient of compassion from someone else. And as you think about that, Were there any experiences, any of you, just sort of a show of hands, that interaction took less than 10 minutes? How about less than 5 minutes? Okay? And maybe for some of you, less than a minute. Yeah? Okay? And also, when you experienced this, was your experience, did any of you experience this more than a month ago? Oh, you guys really are working in good organizations. How about anybody longer than that? Okay. Wow, you guys are great. Okay, so you are leaders. That's fabulous. So I want to note this as an element of compassion. I'm going to focus on compassion and distinguishing it as we move forward from a term that's been dropped a few times, and I expect that our keynote speaker will also speak about it in terms of empathy. But I also want to note from my own research, working primarily in acute care hospitals, including every one of the major healthcare systems in this region, as well as behavioral health organizations, that oftentimes when I've worked with teams and talking about culture change, developing compassion capability in their workforce and what they might do and what enables their teams to be successful, they often, sometimes in some situations, and maybe in those past workplaces you've experienced this, where people think they just don't have the time. And I just want to note that for most of you, from the hands that I saw, the interaction that you're still thinking about that made you feel cared for took less than 10 minutes. For some of you, less than 5. And one of the experimental pieces of research that has been done within the healthcare setting had to do with doctors engaging with patients who were finding out for the first time that they were receiving a cancer diagnosis. And a particular experimental piece of research changed how doctors were interacting with these patients in a systematic way to see if how we interacted and what we said mattered for patient anxiety, and in the longer term, going along with the treatment regimen and doing what you needed to do to get better and to engage in the treatment patterns that needed to happen. And this research varied what doctors said and noted that the amount of time that it took to make a statistically significant change in the experience of these newly diagnosed cancer patients was 40 seconds. This work is covered by some clinician researchers in a book also called Compassionomics that builds on this research and has these clinicians have used it in their own work and have reinforced these findings, that it may take as little as 40 seconds to make a difference in how people are feeling about their work, their lives as your colleagues and coworkers, and the performance and your ability to retain them as high-performing workers. 40 seconds. And the elements of these interactions may reflect what, if you think about your interaction, had to do with. And it's not isolating people as individual performers, but rather saying things along the lines of, we are in this together. Giving a sense that I have your back. We will work through the challenges, and I'm here for you. Okay? 40 seconds. And as I was looking at the SHRM website, I am not a human resources professional, but I noticed that they have a very strong model of flourishing that is here on the right. Many of you are probably familiar with this. And I want to note this because there are so many elements to today's flourishing human experience and also flourishing workplace that it has to do with social wellness, occupational wellness, spiritual wellness, financial wellness, environmental wellness. This can seem daunting until one realizes that making a difference in any of these capacities helps advance someone toward flourishing. the complete human flourishing that combines all aspects of our lives, inside and outside of the workplace. And as I was reading a little bit more about the future of today's workplaces, because I'm familiar with healthcare, but you represent obviously a wide range of workplaces, where there are maybe fewer opportunities for interaction with your colleagues when there is remote work or hybrid work. Those interactions need to be intentional and focused on, hence 40 seconds might be useful in that regard. And also I was struck by the human capital trends that are happening right now in 2025 with the push for AI, and again, the sort of challenge with in coming to work, staying in hybrid modes, and all of this uncertainty. I was struck that human performance, that is, those behaviors that affect your bottom lines, really are now seen as needing something in today's uncertain environment, something more than just the performance management review. All of you are probably not surprised by that. But the notion that we really do need to adopt additional practices, not just as individuals, but also as teams and as organizational systems, to engage our workforce in a unique way moving forward in these times, but also as a way to recognize that individual flourishing and system flourishing go hand in hand. And as a sociologist, that's really what we focus on, is being able to move between the micro and the macro and see the connections and explain and understand those connections. And so I'd like to now shift to my focus on compassion. And compassion has many definitions, but one definition can be this one, what we know about it. Compassion is an intimate awareness of suffering, and most critically, with actions to alleviate it. With actions to alleviate it. Now, why compassion? Well, compassion makes us feel good. It is one of the processes when we engage in compassionate acts, and when you received that compassionate act that you might have reflected on, our neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, they are activated. So they literally, those acts make us feel good, neuroscientifically. And it also, relatedly, compassion improves our physical health and our individual resilience to stressors. It promotes our life off the job and on the job. In promoting, research has shown that it promotes parental nurturance and effective communication with partners and friends. And in terms of our workplace, it's been shown to lead us to see ourselves, our coworkers, and our organizations more positively, and to draw on President Niemer, perhaps granting grace or forgiveness, and also generates more commitment and contentment in our places of work across time. So compassion is pretty powerful. I want to distinguish, however, empathy from compassion. The two are different. The two are highly related. And oftentimes when you speak about compassionate practice, empathy is needed, and we need to generate skills at empathy, affective empathy, which has to do with the mirroring and the felt experience of others' emotions, is one piece of it. The cognitive empathy is being able to put ourselves in another person's shoes, right? The key part that might facilitate compassion. But I also want to refer to some early work by a neuroscientist and her team, Tara Singer from the UK, who did a pretty unique experiment using fMRI technology, and this is a rough graphic of her work, noting the difference and really helping us understand why empathy, stopping with the feeling with, is not really going to do it. We need to move from the feeling with to the actual attempts to alleviate suffering. And so on the left side of this graphic, Singer and her colleagues brought partners, primarily married couples, into her lab. And she first took one of the partners and subjected them to electroshocks, a common thing. They were painful. And they were hooked up to an fMRI machine, hence showing where pain is occurring in the brain. And on the left side, the entire pain matrix is being activated there, okay? The physical pain matrix on the top of the brain, and the affective or felt pain, where we say, oh, I'm feeling pain, on the side. She then unhooked that person and hooked up their partner to that electroshock and had their first person watch their partner be shocked and experience pain. That watching yielded brain activity as well. Not in this case the physical pain, the top, but on the right side, the felt pain. So the notion that we actually, when we're engaged in empathy, feel another person's pain is supported by these types of neuroscientific experiments. It also suggests that when you ask nurses about why they love their jobs, and other healthcare professionals and people in other organizations as well, why do they love their jobs? Because I can make a difference, because I can help, because I can make someone's life better. And when you're in nursing and when your patients are in pain, the goal is to alleviate that pain. And sometimes the systems, whether they be people calling in sick, not being there, so low staffing, sometimes pharmacy hasn't delivered the carts and the meds that you need. If you're not able to alleviate the pain of your patients, you leave that workday in heavy feelings of empathy, feeling people's pain because you were not enabled to alleviate their suffering. You were not enabled to engage in the act of compassion. And oftentimes, particularly in behavioral health and therapeutic contexts, there is a reference to compassion fatigue, right? If we care too much, we're going to result in compassion fatigue. Don't care too much because you're going to result in compassion fatigue. And I want to just make reference to the neuroscience sort of brain images that I just showed you to say that when you're in empathy, you're feeling with, that affective empathy of feeling with, feeling another's emotions, literally feeling another's pain. But when you engage in compassion, you have an awareness of that suffering, but you are engaged in attempts to alleviate it. And so I just want to suggest that perhaps it is not compassion fatigue when we are able to engage in those acts to help others, but actually when our systems may block us, our policies, our practices may inhibit us from engaging in that helping activity that gives purpose and meaning to our work. And so I want to suggest we really do need to cultivate compassion. And I want to shift now to seeing compassion. You all experienced an individual interaction that might have been feeling now is that you experience compassion from another person. But I also want to suggest that compassion can be seen as an organizational capability. So an organizational capability, as many of you know, can be seen as being able to consistently produce a collective achievement through organizational members' actions. And I want to suggest, or invite you to consider, that compassion can also become a capability of a team, of a division, of an organization. And that is, organizations can create a reliable capacity for organizational members to notice, feel, and respond to suffering among their members. And so to suggest that compassion capability, like organizational capability, is an experience, a compassionate capacity that is embedded in a relational system, not just one individual at a time. A number of researchers back in the late 20th century and into the early 20th century really came in part from the University of Michigan's School of Business, started to look at this issue of compassion capacity, compassion capability, and one of the places they went was a billing department in a healthcare system, not the nurses and so on, but a billing department. And so I want to just give you an example of the qualitative, a couple of qualitative quotes that came out of that early research, indicating what denotes this. And you'll see that these are very simple acts, but repeated over and over can really make a difference. So the notion of compassion capability of, when I know somebody's having a bad day, they've got all this work on their desk, I'll just go over and help them. What do you need, and how can I help? 40 seconds. And also the notion that this could become a routine practice, the way we do things here, to refer back to Amanda's point, a part of our culture, the way we do things. Okay? If you come to work at this place, you see how people get excited about doing things for people. And I think that it just becomes part of your norm, if it wasn't before. And if you practice it enough, it becomes the norm. It becomes the culture. It is a practice, and my colleagues and I can now measure this at the level of systems, at the level of teams, and understand to which how many are embedded in this normative system, where are those that are exceeding that system in terms of their practices, and where are the teams that have already established these compassion-capable norms within their larger organization, and does that make a difference? In some small initial behavioral health research that my colleague Jim Diefendorf and I have done with behavioral health organizations in the city of Akron, we were developing a measure of compassion capability and identified that it does seem to really matter for the experience of burnout among human behavioral health and therapy workers. And what we found is if their team had low compassion capability, that it wasn't a norm to look for the opportunities to help not their patients, but their coworkers and colleagues when it was needed, when they saw the work was piling up for them, what do you need and how can I help? We found that low compassion capability groups had the highest level of burnout at a much higher rate. So this is the highest level on a standardized scale of burnout, where it can really start to impact absenteeism, presenteeism, and other kinds of health behaviors that are not beneficial. If you have low compassion capability, you had much higher rates of burnout in that team than if you had high compassion capability. Again, very initial research on this, but suggestive. And it really does matter for burnout, which is different than compassion capability, because the source of burnout really is within systems, policies and practices within culture. Compassion capability does tend to operate as sort of secondary traumatic stress, one individual at a time. So when you're dealing with burnout, you're really dealing with things that human resources professionals can really make a difference in. And as many of you know, burnout does result from the stresses that arise from the interaction between individuals and their work environment. It's that relationship. It's not just within the individual that makes a difference, and that this burnout at the highest levels has been shown to reduce job performance and also create problems with retention. And so addressing burnout really must focus on changes not necessarily at the individual level, but really within the broader organizational environment, systems, policies, and normative practices and relationships. So what some of the colleagues that have been looking at compassion capability have found in more quantitative research is that compassion capability really does help folks in the workplace. For those who suffer, it tends to increase positive emotional experience in the workplace, reducing anxiety and increasing organizational commitment. It tends to communicate dignity and worth, the notion that we're all in this together. And it is a key for preventing not just burnout, but also that individual compassion fatigue. It can moderate the impacts of that secondary traumatic stress if that's occurring in the workplace. Also, importantly, when we engage in compassion and that's what many of you do each and every day, probably you have a high level of compassion satisfaction because you are able to alleviate other suffering. And that is the key thing that I expect we might hear a little bit about, also is grounded in neuroscience, that where empathy can lead to distress because you're feeling others' pain, different neural networks in our brain are activated when we engage in compassionate acts that lead us to actually experience those positive neurotransmitters through helping other people. So it increases compassion satisfaction, your identity as a caring person, and also it is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength within leaders. And overall does tend to improve coworker relationships and increase trust throughout the organization when you have systems that are seen as compassionate. So, a couple of takeaways. It's not the event, it's the everyday. We often try to have events like this and think, oh, these are great things and we're going to learn things and we're going to take things away. But the key thing is less than 10 minutes, less than 5 minutes, maybe even as little as 40 seconds. It's the how are you doing and how can I help? Day in, day out, moments of kindness like the one that you just recalled can make a real difference, and it sticks with you. And secondly, I want to encourage all of you within your organizations to identify the positive deviants. Those teams that are flourishing, even when the larger environment is very uncertain and very stressful. Within healthcare organizations, when I speak to nurses, every nurse that I speak to in a room like this, when I ask them, what's the unit that everyone wants to work on? That when there's an opening in that unit, every nurse applies for it. That team is flourishing amidst whatever happens. It doesn't matter the turnover of individuals. There is a secret sauce, a magic something, a culture that is surviving in that environment amidst the same structure that everyone is going for. I encourage you to ask folks in your organizations, where does everybody want to be? You probably know what those teams are. I encourage you to understand and try to take some time to figure out what are their everyday practices. And think beyond the individual, but relationally, what are they doing each and every day for one another, not just the leader, but all of the team members, again, built into the system, about making a difference and engaging in those compassionate acts every day, even for as little as 40 seconds. And I think that that might be the differentiating factor for your organizations. Thank you so much.